couple of days after the Austrian Grand Prix, the staff at Spandau prison in Berlin found the only prisoner, 93-year-old Rudolf Hess, dead in his cell, having apparently taken his own life. Hess had been a senior figure in the Nazi Party since its very earliest days and was appointed Deputy Führer in 1933. In 1941, however, he took off in his personal aircraft, an unarmed Messerschmitt 110 fighter, and flew to Scotland, under the mistaken impression that King George VI wanted to end the war over Churchill's head, and hoping to arrange a diplomatic coup through an apparently sympathetic Scottish lord. Instead, he was arrested and imprisoned, and following the Nuremberg trials, he and several others were sentenced to life in Spandau prison. By 1987, prisoner number 7 was the last survivor, the others having died or been released early. Following his death, the prison was demolished soon afterwards. 2 days later, a man armed with a pistol and 2 semi-automatic rifles killed 16 people, including his own mother and an unarmed policeman, and injured 15 more before shooting himself in the historic market town of Hungerford, about 40 miles west of London. The news shocked Britain, and Home Secretary Douglas Hurd commissioned an inquiry, which resulted the following year in the banning of private ownership of all semi-automatic rifles and heavy restrictions on shotgun ownership. It remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in British history, and no motive has ever been ascertained. And the F1 community was saddened to hear of the death of Didier Pironi. The French driver, widely regarded as the man who should have been champion in 1982, had decided that after tests with AGS and Ligier in 1986 that he wasn't going to be able to compete in F1 at the highest level, and he moved into powerboat racing with some success, having won a race at Arendal in Norway just 8 days before his death. But at the Needles Trophy race off the Isle of Wight, his boat Colibri, Hummingbird, which he'd designed himself, hit the wake of an oil tanker and flipped, killing Pironi and his 2 crew, Bernard Giroux and Jean-Claude Guernard. His girlfriend Catherine Gu was pregnant with twins at the time, and when they were born, they were named Didier and Gilles. The latter, at the time of writing, works for the Mercedes Formula One team and was present on the podium for Lewis Hamilton's British Grand Prix win in 2020. While it was no longer as traditional the end of the European season, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza has been the scene of dramatic announcements and press conferences over the decades. This year the news was less dramatic in that it was expected. Ayrton Senna would partner Alain Prost for McLaren in 1988, and in the back of their cars would be Honda engines. In the back of next year's Williams would instead be a 3.5-litre normally aspirated engine built by John Judd, who'd been successfully building engines for IndyCar and, under the Honda brand, for Formula 3000. The latter engine would form the basis of his new Formula One engine for Williams and the March team in 1988, and Frank Williams was, at least publicly, confident that it would be competitive.
Well, certainly there's no wailing of gnashing of teeth here at Williams. We have a very strong programme for next year. A new car, maybe with active ride, with a Judd V8 engine, which will be very competitive in normally aspirated terms. And we wait with interest to see just how much horsepower the turbos will actually be able to race with next year. It may not be as much as people think.
More immediately, Williams had been working on their own version of the active suspension system, which they would debut on Piquet's car. Mansell, who had suffered through Lotus's earlier attempts to introduce active ride, was sceptical, but the team hoped that, as this was a mechanical hydraulic system rather than a complex electronic one, it ought to be more reliable. Ozella, at their home race, were running a second car for Swiss driver Franco Forini, while the Little Coloni team would enter their first race, one of 2 entries this year, in preparation for a full campaign in 1988. Their entry would be driven by Italian Nicola Larini, also making his debut. With motor racing banned in his native Switzerland, Franco went to Italy to pursue a career in the sport. He won his first Formula 3 race in 1983 at the age of 25 in a Dallara chassis, and for the following 2 years drove for the Venturini team, developing the Dallara into a consistent race winner. In 1985 he moved to the Forti Corse team and won the Italian F3 title ahead of Alex Caffi and Fabrizio Barbazza. A move up to Formula 3000 for 1986 yielded poorer results, with a 6th place the highlight, but he was able to get some sponsorship together to fund a second Ozella car for 3 races. From a small town in Tuscany, Larini showed an aptitude for racing at a young age and made his way up through karting to Formula Fiat Abarth by the age of 20, then into Italian F3, where he won races immediately in 1985. In 1986 he was paired with the highly fancied Marco Apicella at Enzo Coloni's team with Dallara chassis and raised several eyebrows by taking the title. Coloni dabbled in F3000 in 1987 before deciding to make the step straight up to F1 for 1988, and Larini would come with them for this exploratory foray. With all that to digest, qualifying got underway and was thankfully less eventful than in Austria 3 weeks earlier. With 2 extra entries, 2 drivers would fail to qualify for the first time this year, which gave an extra edge to the non-turbo qualification. Piquet took Williams' first active pole, and his third of the year, speed trapped at a peak of 352 km an hour, 219 miles an hour, with Mansell a 10th behind, then Berger third again in the ever-improving Ferrari, which the fans would be hoping he could finish this time. Senna was happier with his own active suspension but was still a second off Berger in 4th, while Prost, still suffering from a lack of power and an intermittent misfire from his tag engine, could only manage 5th, ahead of the 2 Benettons. Alboreto was back in 8th for his 100th race, after crashing his race car and having to qualify in the spare, and the 2 Brabhams made up the top 10 ahead of a miserable Johansson, now confirmed to be out of a seat next year and looking for offers. Zaxpeed had done a lot of work on their chassis and were looking better, though they were still down on power, while Ligier hadn't set times at all on Saturday after prolonged arguments with Jaime Mada about how to optimise their engines. Franco Forini just made the grid on his first race, but fellow debutant Larini would join Pascal Fabre on the pit wall as non-qualifiers for the race. Sunday afternoon and everyone lined up after the parade lap, only for there to be a slight panic as smoke seemed to be rising from Patrese Brabham and a small fire was spotted. The marshals raced into action, the fire was extinguished, but after a bit of poking it was quickly established that it was nothing serious, just some fuel vapour cooking off, and since the start procedure hadn't been initiated, they could just do another parade lap and try again, so they did. So after that they were ready to go in the now 50-lap race, and it was Mansell who beat Piquet off the line, only for the Brazilian to surge back and take the lead into the first chicane, with Berger still third and Prost making his way up a place to 4th, and Senna dropping right back behind Boutsen, who took 4th from Prost too, partway around lap 1. Fabi, meanwhile, had gone in the other direction, dropping behind Alboreto and Johansson. Mansell seemed to be dropping back quite quickly, and soon had Berger trying to get past, only for an inspired Boutsen to nip past both of them as Mansell outbraked himself at the Roggia. Berger followed through shortly afterwards as Mansell's mirrors began to be filled by the white and red of Prost's McLaren. That was soon replaced by the yellow of Senna's Lotus, as Prost too began dropping back with those intermittent engine cutouts still plaguing him. During all that excitement, Alboreto had shed his left side pod cover, which was retrieved off the track by a brave marshal, but continued apparently fine, as both Brabhams dropped out in the first 8 laps, Patrese with engine troubles and De Cesaris with a dodgy suspension. Alboreto's side pod cover may not have been a problem, but his Ferrari turbo once again was, and he recorded his 8th retirement of the year and his 7th in a row after just 13 laps as Piquet continued to ease out a lead. Mansell got himself going and got past Berger again on lap 17, and swiftly followed up by passing Boutsen a few laps later, only to pit for tyres on lap 22, with half distance already approaching. He returned to the track 5th, ahead of Johansson. Senna, meanwhile, had eased past both Boutsen and Berger to go second, just before both of them pitted anyway on the same lap, leaving the pits as one and diving for the Rettifilio together, Boutsen just edging it to hold on to the place as both slithered around on cold tyres. Berger continued worrying at the Benetton though, as Piquet made his stop on lap 24. It was a long stop, and Senna went by into the lead, with Piquet emerging right in front of Mansell. Senna's lead was about 12 seconds, but Piquet was whittling it away as he stayed ahead of Mansell. Meanwhile, Berger and Boutsen were still going at it hammer and tongs, with Berger now getting past the Benetton. It was by now over 2/3 distance, and Senna still showed no signs of pitting and was well over 5 seconds ahead of Piquet as Mansell dropped back with a rough-sounding Honda. Realising that Ayrton wasn't stopping, Nelson put the hammer down and broke the lap record and got it down to 4 seconds, then 3, then 2.4, and then on lap 43, Senna lapped Ghinzani, put a worn tyre on the dirty stuff and was off. He kept it going and rejoined, but Piquet was past and Senna now had dusty tyres. Further back, Palmer got it all wrong at the Rettifilio trying to get out of Mansell's way and ended up nearly hitting him and forcing him onto the grass. Senna, meanwhile, was catching Piquet again despite his dusty tyres, a masterclass in car control as he rocketed around the track, but the gap was just too big and Nelson Piquet took the win, his 3rd of the year and Williams' 6th on the trot. Or did he? The checkered flag wasn't shown as he crossed the line after the arranged 50 laps, and it wasn't until he was halfway round that the message seemed to get through to the official with the flag, who started waving it rather belatedly. So the race did indeed count after 50 laps, and that was just as well for Senna, who finished second, then rolled to a stop on his way back to the pits and had to hitch a lift back on board 11th placed Nakajima's car. Mansell finished third, with Berger a very creditable fourth after a great race-long battle with Boutsen, who took fifth, with Johansson salvaging a point for McLaren after Prost had been in and out of the pits all afternoon and trailed in 15th and 4 laps down. Alliot had been leading the 3.5 litre category till he spun off on lap 37, so Philippe Streff took the win instead, with Capelli second and Palmer third, and presumably hoping to avoid Mansell in the pit lane. It hadn't been a particularly exciting race, and no doubt for McLaren, Honda power and Senna at the wheel couldn't come soon enough, as they dropped behind Lotus in the Constructors' Championship. Piquet and Senna both extended their title lead over Mansell, while Prost was now essentially out of the running, 32 points behind with 5 races left. Theoretically possible, but he'd have to win all of them with nobody else scoring more than 1 or 2. Next on the cards was a 2-race tour of Iberia to finish off the European season with back-to-back races at Estoril and Jerez.